So the topic today is understanding data governance in GCC countries, and we will talk about an overview of how different data governance frameworks have been coming up in the GCC nations, as well as we'll have a specific focus on UAE PDPL as well as the Saudi PDPL. So that would be our primary focus of today's webinar, and a little bit about Tsaaro, that we are a data protection consulting firm primarily based out of India and Europe, and we offer privacy as well as security consulting services to organizations based out of all the continents except for Antarctica, of course. And that's what we do as an organization. And we also have Tsaaro Academy, where we roll out certain privacy-oriented certifications. Now, before we start, Faisal, I would just hand it over to you. If you can give us an introduction and probably also talk a bit about why you decided to start a career in security and compliance, and what are the key developments that you see that would happen around in the space.
Well, hi everyone. My name is Faisal Khan, and I'm actually heading the IT security and compliance at the Dubai World Trade Center. DWTC is actually the UAE's leading event venue and the largest event and exhibition center in the entire of GCC. So yes, we connect people, we connect products and the ideas around the globe through year-round calendars for international trade fairs, blockbuster consumer shows, and of course prestigious international conference. And much more. Career has been in the IT security domain for the last 2 decades, I would say, initially from the infrastructure side. And of course, the need to have, governance and compliance is kind of the requirement, or I would say the increasing or in the demand for the UAE. Similarly, the same translation is actually now somewhat seen in the Saudi as well. So I could say that this is something that was long back on my card, and I really wanted to do something that can benefit the community. And this is exactly why I'm here today, so that I can share some of those experiences with respect to governance and the challenges that we have within the UAE, and in GCC, I would say specific to the UAE and a bit of Saudi that I would touch.
Definitely. Perfect. Thank you, Faisal. Thank you for that introduction. And it's a great honor for people who are willing to come in and participate and share their insights. And I think it's great for all the attendees who have joined us, because the most of the questions that I would probably ask you are probably the real world scenarios that people are facing right now, especially because of the newer standards that are coming up, right? Everyone is suddenly focusing a lot on regulatory compliance, specifically in the GCC region, right? And as a small organization, or as a medium organization, when you don't have the necessary support or resources to implement a data governance program, right? I think your insights and your inputs would definitely be helpful for those people, right? Just a disclaimer as well, that whatever we are discussing here today, none of it is or should be considered as legal advice, simply for reference and educational purposes, right? If you want legal advice, I would recommend you go hire a lawyer, because we are a consulting firm and Faisal, of course, represents DWTC, right? So none of this should be considered as legal advice. Looking at the agenda for today, these are the topics we would discuss. We would talk a bit about the evolution of data governance in GCC countries and what was the journey that data governance took. We'll talk about the existing data governance frameworks, and like we also discussed a few minutes back, we would focus on the PDPL of UAE as well as KSA, and compare it to the GDPR, because it's easier for people to understand whenever we compare a data protection law to GDPR. And then we'll also talk a bit about challenges to data governance. And let's begin. Now, Faisal, I think before we even go on to this introduction slide or the introductory slide, what is your opinion on why is data governance important? And if I am working in an organization that has primarily had a good IT team, right? The IT infrastructure is very relevant and the data science team is also very relevant. But how can data governance support these initiatives, and how can leader bring in data governance into the picture? So what would be your opinion?
Well, first of all, I think what we need to start with is with the definition of data governance, because often this gets confused within the mindsets of individuals. It's a terminology that needs to be understood well when it comes to the field of security, the privacy. So I would probably give you a layman's term here, which means that it refers to the management and control of an organization's data asset. All right. What does that mean? That means information data. that sits within an organization, the effective measures to manage and control, right? It includes processes, it includes policies, standards for how do you collect data, how do you share data, or how do you actually store that. And again, on top of that, what you need to make sure is that is it secure and is it in a compliant manner? Basically, the life cycle of the information data from the time of creation to the time of disposal. So yeah, I mean, this is what governance basically, or data governance in a layman's term would really be. Some core competence that I would really emphasize on, and I would really want to put that up, kind of like a code, is that we have to focus on data quality, and forced to ensure what kind of data that we're taking in, the accuracy of the data, the completeness of the data, the consistency of the data. Then we have the aspect of data security, and these are the core components that I'm talking to you about. So I've talked to you about data quality, data security now, and data privacy is something that we have to ensure that the data is collected and stored, as I said, in a secure manner, along with compliance and regulatory laws. Then we have, I would say the custodians for data. We often term them as stewardship. So yeah, we have to, start looking into assigning ownership and responsibility for these data assets as well. Initially, it may sound, a bit too much, but I'm sure when you start getting into this and understanding more about data governance, I think this is definitely going to become pretty easy.
Faisal, I would just want to add on to a question there. You mentioned that we have to identify data owners or data stewardships. So how do we do that? Because when you get into an organization and when you look at the process, right, everyone tends to move away from claiming ownership to data, because business, some people would say that it's the IT system or the IT person who should be the owner. Then the business person may say that there are multiple businesses using this data, so I will not be the owner. So what is your take on this?
Well, I completely agree with you, Krishna, on this, because quite honestly, since concept is fairly new to this region, I would say, and people were not used to taking ownership of their own data in that matter, they would always assume the fact that this is company data and this is kind of governed by the IT department who should look after that. So they have to make sure that the data is secure. They have to make sure which meets up with compliant regulations, which is fair enough. But the thing is that what needs to be understood, and again, it's top-down approach whereby we have to educate. We have to educate this, and it's going to take some time. You have to bring in that culture whereby individuals will have to understand and take ownership and responsibility, on individual levels. Because remember one thing: at the end of the day, that data that sits within a specific department, as I would say, is the responsibility of those individuals, and they are the best person to actually validate or understand what is it being collected for, why is it being stored. The security perspective or the aspects of it are secondary. Definitely those have to be covered as part of the regular IT security domain.
Right. So Faisal, having said that, I think we know that there are certain national data strategies that are coming in as well, right? There's one where Bahrain has come up with an open data strategy where organizations or anyone in general are free to use publicly available data from the government and also use it to create specific data science models or machine learning models. So what is your take on this? How do you think a national data strategy could assist a specific nation or a government?
From economic perspective, I think Bahrain, again, like any other GCC country, is looking to have a lot of tourists that they really want to attract. They really want to work on the commonalities of data that can actually give them a boost in terms of footfall of tourism of
right.
people. Right. So I think that's what the intention is in this strategy.
Yeah, I think we are also seeing a lot of different cybersecurity regulations come in, because if I specifically look at India, I know that there are multiple guidelines by the Security and Exchange Board as well as the Reserve Bank of India, right? So BFSI and the financial services sector is highly regulated. which means that they have a list of frameworks or guidelines that they have to fulfill. Similarly, I think there was a recent one that came in for portfolio managers where they have to comply with the cybersecurity framework by October this year, right? So these developments were mostly focused on the financial services industry. But do you think there is a requirement for governments to come up with a national cybersecurity framework, something such as what Qatar has, right?
Well, most definitely, yes. I mean, with the increase of threats and especially during the pandemic, when the whole world actually went back, working from home, and looking at the statistics that are available on the internet, we all saw a lot of cyber attack, and it's come to that realization basically that every other country understands that they need to have a very robust cybersecurity framework. The UAE is working on one already. I mean, Saudi's working, and I'm sure the other GCC countries, which I'm not really aware of, would also not be standing behind.
Right. I think it's probably become a notion that cyber risk is one of those business risks that you have to account for. And I think leaders are also increasingly becoming aware of it, which is why there are certain conditions whenever newer organizations or organizations just wish to go for an IPO, for example, right? Appointing a CISO has kind of become mandatory in most jurisdictions or nations. And it's what we could probably see for the GCC area as well, right? Let's also look at the evolution of data governance in the GCC countries. And I mean, the GCC area has been very much ahead in terms of technological advancements or infrastructure developments. Similarly, if you look at data governance and if you look at Saudi or Kingdom of Saudi Arabia specifically, right? So Faisal, what is your opinion on the data governance framework that has come up in the Saudi Arabia region? And do you see a similar framework that will probably come up for the UAE region as well?
Well, I would probably take one step back and tell you about the UAE first, because of course, and being specific with respect to Dubai. All right. So because Dubai is the hub for travel and tourism. So if you look at it from the perspective of Dubai itself, within the UAE, right, that's one state. That has alone experienced 14.4 million visitors in 2020. Right? That's kind of like a staggering 97% increase from the year 2021. Of course, we need to also keep in mind that the ease of restrictions after the global pandemic is definitely something that needs to be understood. But what does this all mean? What does this all account for? It actually means that we have a lot of measures, and we actually need to have a lot of measures and controls now in place over the data that we are now collecting. So this realization is becoming, extremely, extremely important for not only Dubai but UAE as a country, and Saudi is no different. I mean, Saudi is very big in terms of the area that it spans. The recent tourism initiatives and the 2030 mission that they have means that they will have to really aggressively work on similar lines. That the UAE or Dubai has been working for the last two or more decades.
Right. I think I agree on that. And I also remember coming back from the UAE or Dubai specifically to India sometime back last year. And I remember how easy it was for me as a person whose data, of course, the government had collected to protect their own interests. But while I was leaving the airport, right, towards the security gate, I just had to show my passport, and there was a facial recognition system. Just scanned my face, looked at my passport, and just, probably a 2-second entry, right? It didn't take any more time than that. So I think UAE is definitely putting in those efforts and leveraging the full use of data. But with the implementation of the personal data privacy law, these newer technologies will also have to be evaluated in a sense that they can protect the rights of data subjects as well as international citizens, right? Because if European citizens are coming in, they would definitely have to follow those principles because they're also used to that kind of privacy.
Correct. And just out of the 40-odd million, visitors that UAE had actually experienced, I think around about 1.5 million of Indians actually visited UAE in 2022. That was something that I was reading from the top of the statistic, and also I just remembered that, which is a huge amount of visitors coming in from India alone.
Yep, definitely. So Faisal, I also wanted to shed some light on the part that every GCC nation has their own unique data privacy law. And do you think it would make more sense for a consolidated privacy framework for the entire GCC region? Because we also created a chart sometime recently wherein we were comparing comparing different data privacy rights and whether they were covered in, for example, say Bahrain's law or UAE's law or maybe Saudi's law. And we saw a lot of inconsistency there. So do you think a consolidated privacy framework helps?
Well, I am completely in for a unified privacy data protection law, which is supposed to be very similar to the EU GDPR.
Yeah.
So of course, but at this point in time, I would say because it's kind of like a new thing for the GCC countries to actually embark on, and one after the other, the different countries within the Gulf are actually taking this initiative. So, and you also have to understand one aspect that most of these countries probably did not have data protection or a privacy program before, but they had somewhat of a data governance, framework, which was probably located in free zones, which was located in the health sector. So they were kind of, working on smart data strategies, on data governance for that perspective. But when it comes to being a law, of course, this all has to be unified, and bits and pieces from the existing data governance requirement would somehow need to actually trickle down into the primary PDPL framework. And it is yet to be seen, in terms of how this really would evolve in the future. But I'm definitely in for this understanding, and I have a strong belief that as these programs would start maturing up, or framework, I would say, then we should at some point in time see a unification.
Yep, I think it makes sense for a unified privacy framework as well, looking at how the area is so closely connected to each other and the kind of provisions they could also potentially have. So having said that, I think a lot of people may not know this, but India also had a data governance policy that came up sometime in 2019 or 20, I believe, but there was not much deliberation on it or much action on it. But of course, India has also been thinking of a data governance policy at least. And there was also a Healthcare Act that was proposed. It was called Disha sometime in 2018 or 19 again. I mean, all these nuances started, or all these requirements started when data privacy was accepted as a fundamental right? So data governance came into picture, healthcare acts came into picture, but they're just policies for now. We're just waiting on, some further action from the government on how they can become a regulatory requirement as well as a framework, right? And at the same time, I think the GCC countries are transforming critically and more faster than any other country across the globe. And that is also what makes them, or makes it very important for them to follow certain standards that are set out by maybe European organizations, European nations, or the United States, as well as the organizations that are based out of United States. So it's becoming increasingly important to comply with those requirements. Let's talk a bit about the existing data governance framework in Saudi, Faisal. And while I am personally working a lot on this data governance framework, I think the more challenges that I have faced when I recently started was around the data management aspect, right? Because when we take it to leadership usually thinks that data privacy is just data governance, right? Then we'll also have to help them understand why is it not the same and all of those things.
Absolutely.
Right. So Faisal, my question to you would be, when we look at data governance, we have data security, we have data privacy, which are topics we are comfortable with. But then there's a whole section of topics that focus more on data quality, metadata management, data cataloging. So what is your opinion, and who do you think would be the right IT professionals or people that you would want to rope in to help with those processes?
Being the head of IT security, often it's perceived that when it comes to privacy, and it's often confused, as I told you in the beginning as well, that the privacy aspect have to be actually handled by, could be the InfoSec, the team or the CISO in that manner. However, data privacy dedicated and a separate line, which needs to be understood, and it needs to be adapted in its entirety, understanding the framework. So when I say this, of course, what IT security does not do is that they do not understand, they're not trying to understand where is this data coming from, why is this data not so important for a department as against to the other. This is the task of privacy and data privacy, and I would say the task of a data privacy, a DPO that you would refer to actually lead, and they're the best person who would want to really identify or define, I would say, the processes whereby those data that that you think that IT security does not understand. They only look at it from a perspective of securing that, right? The DPO would have a different way or view to look at it.
Right. So I agree with that, Faisal, because when we look at data governance, we usually have this designation CDO, or the Chief Data Officer, or sometimes it's also called as Chief Digital Officer. But here, let's focus on the Chief Data Officer role, right? And this role, what I have seen personally is that a lot of people from the data analytics background are usually evolving or transforming into this role. Now, what I also see is that data governance is not something that one individual can fully implement, especially for a larger organization, right? If you are a global multinational organization, then you would need a global DPO, a global CISO, and probably a global CDO as well. And I think these three designations come together to support implementation of data governance as well as evaluation of it.
One good part, Krishna, here is that at least, with respect to a DPO, I mean, for the knowledge of everyone who's here, is that we can actually have virtual DPOs, or you can have, you can subscribe to a DPO as a service, as far as I understand, because the law permits. But when it comes to being a CISO, or it's even part of regulation standards and compliance standards, you're not supposed to sublet that function out.
Yeah, I think that's a fairly good point, Faisal, because a lot of times, and what we're also seeing in the industry is that there are not enough qualified privacy professionals who can take in the designation of global DPOs, which is why a lot of organizations are focusing on just outsourcing that service so that they can probably build in that role and push someone internally to take up that role. Meanwhile, the operations still go on, right? And they can still
at some point in time, you will actually land in that journey where you will have, you probably haven't hired, or and I would say probably in the initial stages of your data privacy program, I think it's a good idea, to lend some service from a virtual service or a virtual DPO service, or make use of virtual DPO.
Right. And with that, I think I also want to add in the supervisory authority and the offices in Saudi that are responsible for data governance. The first one is NDMO. We have something similar in India as well. It's called IDMO, Indian Data Management Office. And NDMO is, of course, National Data Management Office of Saudi Arabia. Similarly, we have the SDAIA as well, the Saudi Authority for Data and Artificial Intelligence, right? So basically, these two different bodies came in together and created the data governance framework, and it also supports the PDPL, right? The PDPL is also directly under the SDAIA. So that's just how the regulatory structure is there. And Faisal, do you think it's a good idea to have a specific supervisory body for data governance? And how do you think it would be helpful in terms of certain dispute resolutions or certain guidances that people would require in terms of implementation? And I would just want to add one more question onto that. I'm sorry for a lot of questions, but looking at the data governance standard for Saudi, I have personally seen that there's a lot of tool involvement, right? It focuses a lot on implementing automated tools that will help you support certain data governance activities. So let's just focus on this question on how important do you think would be a tool in implementation of data governance, and would it fasten the process of implementation as well?
I would 100% agree to this, but no, there's no tool available in, I would say, which does not require the initial framework to be lined up. So when I say this, it means that you need to have the initial definition for your data completed. That would be the most time-consuming effort. Those tools can actually then be built on top of that, automate the processes which have been identified and then are demarked, I would say, to make things easier.
Right. So I think what you're also trying to say is that we need to have this framework, or basically a foundation on which the tool can be implemented.
Yes, absolutely. And it's that is the major process, which is not going to be.
Yeah, I think one of the other concerns that we usually see in different markets is that small and medium-sized organizations, right, it's becoming increasingly painful for them to straight away implement a data governance tool, right? So do you have any suggestions for smaller organizations and how they can also comply? And at the same time, probably use certain Excel sheets and do some automation over that. It's probably a method that comes to my mind.
The idea that I would probably prefer, or I would also take up as part of initiating my data governance practices, because I need to first of all account for what kind of data I have, where do I have that, I mean, how am I storing this, where am I, all that needs to actually go in Excel sheets. And I would do this, as I said, I mean, because I have various departments across my verticals, and I need to understand which department has, a customer facing, front, which collect more amount of data. What's the kind of data that they're collecting? Are we really keeping a close eye on that or not? because from an IT security perspective or infosec perspective, every data is important for us, and we need to look after the security and the data leakage. However, when you talk about personal data, then it's kind of like zeroing into a specific, and that is what we need to actually extract out of your overall data or information asset that we have, and that cannot be done without the help of the data champions or the steward that I had actually talked about in the initial start of my presentation. So that has to actually be aligned, and I would definitely go with the with the initiative of using Excel sheets from the beginning.
Right. So I think Faisal, one different kind of question, something not related to data governance specifically, but just want to understand whether anyone in your known circle of colleagues or maybe friends, has anyone ever been impacted by fraud or a cyber fraud specifically?
We see this day in, day out, to be honest. I mean, it's all about educating people, and that's why I said the country has embarked on a cybersecurity strategy and framework, which is keen to see its people being secure from all sort of threats. And this is why the trickle down effect in terms of the strategy that the government has, that needs to actually go down to every other organization. Your training programs, need to beef up those knowledges, and you have to circulate them across to your individual, to your staff, to your people, so that they are well aware of the do's and don'ts. Basically, so they need to definitely know what could happen if they an external system to their corporate network. What would happen if they don't click on a link that looks a bit suspicious? These are things which are need to go in as part of your day-to-day learning exercise.
Right. Agreed, Faisal. I think from that perspective of spreading awareness around cybersecurity and basic security hygiene, I think it's something that's being pushed in India in the recent few months. There are a lot of videos that go around. There are a lot of messages that banking organizations send to you as well. But I personally, I think I know a lot of people in my circle who have been affected by some kind of cyber fraud, and they usually come to me looking that I work in cybersecurity and privacy, and they expect me to take out those funds or probably help them get those funds back. But of course, I mean, I think we are slowly seeing some improvements there because of the kind of awareness the government is also trying to push.
100%. I mean, even for that matter, I've seen a lot of measures that even banks have taken from that perspective. Even if they identify a suspected transaction that would happen, they would immediately either stop that from happening, or they would actually take your consent. And I'm using the word consent because this is something that we will talk about in a while from now.
That's right. Yeah, I think I just recently made a credit card transaction, and the bank or my banking manager called me up to confirm whether I actually made that transaction or not. Right. So banks are definitely taking in certain steps, because I think towards the very end, the goal of these cyber frauds is mostly financially driven or financially motivated, and it's not that they are trying to look into identity fraud, because of course personal data of Indians are quite out there when you look at the dark web. Let's talk about the data governance framework for UAE, and I think we'll specifically focus on the data privacy law, Faisal, and that's what we want to focus on. And if you would also shed some light on the free zones in UAE, right, and how it differs from the normal jurisdictional impact of all the other regions, right? So I'll just give it back to you.
Yeah. So I think in the initial start, when I did talk to you about having a different economic zones, like free zones and the healthcare sectors, and the financial market that we have both in Dubai and Abu Dhabi, they all had their data protection laws, all right, which were applicable to them, not today, not yesterday, but from a very long, even before the PDPL was even envisioned. So I would say that, and it had to be, because of course you need to protect financial data, you need to protect healthcare related data, because this is something which is definitely following from an international standard, from an international perspective as well. So there was awareness on those aspects, right? And from that perspective. So I would say that it really helped. These data protection laws did help us to align the kind of give us the initial stages and the starting point to how the PDPL should actually be formed, right? And this is how I would say that it will need more maturity, and that's why I do have a belief that at some point in time when the frameworks will actually mature up, and specifically talking about the PDPL, most of the GCC countries would probably agree to having a unified data protection law.
Right. I think on top of that, Faisal, we have a question from Shreyas, and the question is very much focused on this as well. Right. So Shreyas wants to understand whether, the UAE government focuses on data localization, right? And do you think Saudi would be a more flexible market? And do you see there's a likelihood for some changes there?
Okay, so that's a very good question, I would say. Data localization or data residency is something that we often talk about. The issue is that it's not entirely possible to have a data residency or data localization if you talk about a lot of these cloud services, all right? And because the likes of all these cloud service providers or CSPs that you would term them as are actually in their initial stages when setting up data centers across UAE. All right, Microsoft is available here. We have AWS to an extent. Google's trying to step in as well. But again, the reach or the range of these services are not locally as available as they are within the West, I would say, or anything outside the UAE. All right. As part of the regulation, we have to comply with the data localization, with data residencies. However, UAE is a bit easy on the, I would say the exceptions on the localization or the residency, provided that, the governing bodies or the regulatory does give you the allowance to do so, right? It is up to them to approve so that you can actually go outside, have your data sitting with specific conditions. Let's put it this way, right? Saudi is very stringent about this fact at this point in time, and data residency or localization is the only way within Saudi at this point in time. So if you were to actually look into cloud services, they have to definitely look into establishing local data centers, before they can actually avail cloud related services, or they would have to embark on on-premises environment.
Yeah, I think I would want to add on to that, Faisal, because the recent union budget bill that came out in India, we had this keyword added known as data embassy, right? So I think looking at that concept, it kind of defeats the purpose of data residency or data localization, because if you're trusting a third nation to store data of your citizens as a government entity, then definitely, I mean, data residency or localization would not make sense, or there would be an exemption that would be granted for that specific case onto that rule. Right. And at the same time, I think the aim of privacy for an organization is, of course, to protect the rights of data subjects. But at the same time, it is also to enable safe and secure transmission of information. Right. And if the latter part is being affected because of data privacy rules, then it is not a pro-business regulation that is coming up, and it needs to be that way too, right? And
completely agree with you on that, Krishna, because we're definitely seeing more awareness, and maturity over a period of time since these laws have actually been talked about and since they've emerged, I would say, right? And this is exactly the reason why you have a good audience of people, joining us today, because they too want to understand, the data privacy aspects and the data governance, in terms of what's really happening, in the GCC, in India, around the world, all right? Everyone has already heard about the GDPR from EU, right? What's coming up next is something that everyone's interested in knowing.
Yeah, I think I agree. And I also wanted to say that I think the privacy keyword or the buzzword has been overtaken a bit by AI these days, right? ChatGPT, AI related frameworks are taking the news by a storm. So we are also probably looking at some kind of balance that would probably happen in the future, and a lot more on frameworks about AI as well, and ethics and privacy, because these are very closely related topics, right? Trust, privacy, ethics, and compliance. So I think it would probably be a part of a broader umbrella wherein we would look at this. So we'll also do a simple comparison, Faisal, in terms of how the PDPL is structured or the UAE's PDPL to the GDPR as well. So some similarities that we see is that consent, right? Faisal, you want to talk about consent. So let's also, put it back on you. So
yeah, I mean, consent is something that we normally do not realize how important it is. All right. If you actually look at it from the data privacy perspective, I actually have to give it to this framework that actually they brought in that ethic of requesting you whether do you really want, participate or do you want to really do this? This is something that was really missing from our cyber war, right? It was just, I mean, there were no questions asked. You did not know where your cookies are being stored, how are they being handled, how are they being managed, how are they being internally, used to actually give you information or being passed on to third parties for processing. But at this point in time, with the world having more familiarity with the awareness, it is becoming increasingly important for everyone to actually give in their consent to agree that they have to abide by the processing activities of any organization. So I should know that I am trying to register for an event. My data probably can be used, with third parties. Make it more effective for marketing perspectives, for any reasons for that matter that the organization thinks it attracts me to better opportunities.
Yeah, I think that's there. I mean, because GDPR has created that framework and also pushed that sense and pushed that importance of consent and all the different rights that were so well drafted and easily mentioned, right? I think a lot of the newer data protection laws are following suit and following the framework, and at the same time customizing it to their nation's own personal, culture, as well as how it's functioned or how the nation functions as at a very top level, right? The governance structure of that country as well. So they have very finely looked into those requirements, put up a new law, and also taken into consideration the nation's own unique issues, right? And looking at some of the differences, I would like to also mention that this is something that, these are just slides that we want to also make sure that you guys look into and probably read. But looking at the data breach notification, the PDPL does not have a specific time frame around it, notified immediately, right? And that's what is expected. But of course, when there is not a quantitative measure to it, I think it may also create problems.
Yes, absolutely. So the PDPL, I mean, the notified immediately aspects, yes, definitely. I would say that this needs to improve.
Yeah, because in India we have certain has mentioned that you have to notify the certain body within 6 hours of notification of a data breach, right? And you and me, we are security professionals. We also understand how difficult it is to notify someone of a full report of a data breach in 6 hours, right? So it's practically not very possible, or even if you share a report, it would be incomplete.
Right? It would be incomplete. I believe.
Right. So that's definitely there. And I think GDPR, the breach has to be reported to the supervisory authority within 72 hours of becoming aware of it. And that's probably, a better time frame that you just have to notify them. The full activities around root cause analysis as well as containment of the incident, you can definitely take more time to do it.
Krishna, I would probably say that if you can actually elaborate on the ROPA aspects, because of course, they're using data privacy jargons are often confusing for individuals. So just probably if you can.
Of course. Right. Looking at the similarities, I was focusing on differences, looking at the similarities now. ROPA is something that we do to make sure we have a full view of the different kind of processing activities in an organization. When we say processing, we mean collection, use, transfer, or any of the terms that the data privacy law maintains, right? So ROPA is basically record of processing activities. So you make a record of all the personal data that are involved in different business processes in different departments. And then we also focus more on the sensitivity of the data. If the data is being transferred to a third party, who has access to that data, the security description, whether there is encryption and other additional security measures that we take, right?
And this is exactly where we talked about creating, an Excel sheet to begin.
Yep, I think that's true. I mean, most of the ROPAs that I've done are on an Excel sheet, and of course, some on the tools that we are partners with. But Excel sheet proves to be very useful and very convenient, right? And I mean, unless you are a global multinational organization, Excel sheets are your best friends, right? So that's definitely a very good way way to do Europa. And we spoke a bit about the UAE law and its comparison to the GDPR. Now we look at the KSA and its comparison to the GDPR, right? And I think one key difference here, Faisal, would be about ROPA, right? Because when the PDPL of UAE as well as GDPR, processors and controllers are supposed to conduct a ROPA, but in this case, the processing entity or the processor, there is no obligation to maintain a ROPA.
Which is something that they need to look into.
Definitely, I agree, because I think a lot of organizations can probably find a loophole there and just outsource a lot of activities. Then the processors, all of them would not be as liable as the controller.
So as I said, things are maturing up. These frameworks need a bit more time. All right. And as you can see, as the law comes out or passes in September 2023, you will still need another 6 to 8 months before, the implementation can actually start measuring the I would say the maturity. All right. And there will be realization, all right, because the real life challenges that would actually embark would tend to, give you this opportunity to look into your framework and revise those components, to actually, I would say, to basically streamline.
Right. I agree with that a lot, Faisal, especially on the maturity part, right? So what I'm seeing these days is that a lot of organizations are under purview of these laws, but they have not implemented processes. Now, what happens is that the senior leadership panics and they go out and buy a tool, right? And they buy a tool, but they do not evaluate whether it would fit into the system, whether it would support their IT infra, whether it would solve their problems. But just because they've heard of a tool that can solve issues, they just go and procure it. So it's my personal recommendation to anyone who's just starting out in data privacy that focus on the foundation, right? The policies, the frameworks.
Absolutely. Tools will follow later.
Exactly. So there's a maturity level that you have to take your implementation process to. Start from 1, don't just go to 5 and then regret about not following 1, 2, 3, 4, right? So make sure it's a linear approach in terms of implementation, and at the same time, do not just go out and buy a tool. Evaluate the tool first, or evaluate the options, right? There are so many tools in the market. At least evaluate those options, right? And Faisal, you also mentioned that DPO as a service is something that can be outsourced, right? And it's also a similarity within the PDPL and GDPR.
And I would again highly stress on this aspect, because anyone who's looking into adopting data privacy and as part of the compliance to the law, they should initially, if they can, they should look into getting a virtual DPO or taking up a DPO as a service. Reason being is because the requirement is not only about having the data privacy officer locally available, but also the international, requirement that have to be met as part of the data privacy program need to have that specific knowledge in place. When I say this at this point in time, probably a lot of you all out there do not understand what I'm saying, but when you get into the program, you would know that you'd probably have to have representatives within the different countries that you actually collect data from.
That's true, Faisal. That's true. And I think there's also an additional question from Shreyas following up to the previous one. With the recently approved amendment, do you still see data localization as a requirement in Saudi? So my understanding to this is that it has changed now. There is no specific data localization requirement in Saudi region, but there would be conditions that would come in that focus on when can you not transfer data out of the kingdom to a third-party nation.
Again, has to be done through the National Data Management Office.
That's right. That's right.
With their consent.
Exactly. And looking at the maturity as well, right? We focused a bit about maturity, and this law will also mature. There would be more,
leniency to this.
Come in. Yes. Exactly. There would be, certain aspects that these supervisory authorities are actually learning from the GDPR as well, right? Because GDPR is in no way a perfect law. It's a very good law, but it is no way perfect. And of course,
as they say, there's no such thing as 100% bulletproof. This has to evolve. Even GDPR would, but yeah, at present, that's the only law we can all look at and really get our inspirations.
Yeah, I think we are good with the questions then. Faisal, I would just like to thank you so much.